I've done a few interviews today, and you know, it's very nice. People sort of say, "Oh, you've met all these famous artists, and how did that happen, etc." Where you sort of, was it a plan? Of course, it wasn't a plan. You know, like most young people, I was a bit of a loose end. I was studying at Cambridge in England, and I'd just done a course of art history. That seemed to me, I'd taken it mainly because I knew nothing about it. You know, I sort of saw this art history. I thought, what's that? So I thought, I just signed up for it. But my professor, this is way back, this is in 1962, 63, way back, and my professor was an expert in the Renaissance and in Rubens. And as far as he was concerned, for our course in Cambridge, art stopped dead with the Renaissance and possibly Rubens tacked on. But that was where art finished. And I found it very constrictive to be told, well, that's it. That was art. You know, now we've got nothing. Modern art is worthless, etc., etc. So when I'd finished this course, I persuaded a magazine that was in Cambridge called Cambridge Opinion to do a complete edition, a complete issue on modern art in Britain, because I thought it's all very well knowing about Raphael and Michelangelo and Rubens, etc. But what's happening now? And I had no idea. You know, I was a young man of 18, 19, and I just sort of had questions. I didn't have any answers. So I thought, well, if I do an issue like that, perhaps I'll find out, and perhaps it'll be an interesting thing to do. So somebody said to me, well, if you're doing an issue on modern art in Britain, you have to interview Francis Bacon. And believe me, I had no idea who Francis Bacon was. I said, that's crazy. He's an Elizabethan philosopher who died in the, you know, whenever it was, in the late 16th century. And they said, no, 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 this is a very important, very powerful artist who's just had a huge exhibition at the Tate, and he's really somebody, you know, this is somebody from a more sophisticated background from me, and he said he's really somebody you should talk to. So that's really how my career started off, as my wife well knows. And so I trailed up to London and asked for an interview with Bacon, and I went into a pub, and there was a photographer there who sort of said, well, I don't know, my dear, now that this was sort of kind of gay talk in London, Soho, 1960s, now that she's become so famous, whether she'll ever bother to talk to a mere student like you. And Bacon was standing at the bar, I didn't know it. Suddenly he turned around and he said, don't listen to what that old fool's saying. I adore students. Now, what are you having to drink? So suddenly, from having sort of wandered up to London, I was right in the center of the London art world. And that's the sort of thing, you know, it's a sort of chance thing that you can't plan. I was just very, very lucky. There was a time, that was one thing that I think was marvelous about the much smaller, more modest art worlds, as they were in, say, the 1960s, is that if you went to a certain pub, a certain bar, a certain cafe in London, Paris, New York, you were more or less bound to run into the important artists of the day. They were just there, they were hanging out, they were very unpretentious, and very easy to talk to, very easy to go up to and say hello. And that's what I did, I suppose. I was rather nervous, and I asked Bacon whether he'd do an interview, and he said, yes, what are you doing for lunch? Let's go and have lunch, etc. And there just happened to be Lucian Freud and Frank Auerbach at the lunch, so I met them, and then David Hockney was around, and Kittai, and all these people. So it was a smaller world, a more intimate world, and I guess much more private. I'd found something. I started writing for The Observer. I did very short little reviews of exhibitions in London. But I actually I didn't have a job. I was quite happy not having a job. My father thought that it was time for me to move on and stop living off the family. So I actually got a job in Paris at a magazine called Réalité, and went over to Paris without sort of wanting to, because I was very happy in London. And then I had to make a life there, as you know, young people do. And I was lucky enough because, again, You know, life is a matter of luck very often. This magazine asked me to write about more artists, since they knew that was my background. So I met people like Balthus and Dubuffet, Sonia Delaunay, Henri Cartier-Bresson. Yes, it was a title that was founded in the mid-60s in Switzerland, in Lugano, actually in Zurich. And then the editor, who was a very sympathetic, oddball character called Jim Fitzsimmons, an American of Irish extraction, moved to Lugano, and he single-handedly almost put this magazine, Art International, out for 35 years. And I became very close to him because I became his Paris correspondent. We became friends. And I used to send a report from actually wherever I was traveling, but mainly from France or from London for his magazine. And he was a global art magazine, actually, of the time. And he had correspondents in all the sort of important art centers and some of the occasionally less important art centers, and it really was an international art magazine of that period. Probably the only one. I hadn't thought of that, it's true, yes. The greater facility of travel, the internet, all the things we know, but it is a curious phenomenon, and this book that we've just published is a testimony to that, because we've got artists from every corner of the world in here, and they're all, I think, probably, particularly since they're all in the same book, they must look at each other's work very, very closely. And we're in a curious moment of complete sort of availability of everybody's images, whether it's in books like these or on the internet. Everybody can find out what everybody else is doing. And a lot of people actually follow very carefully. Negative side, I suppose, means that there is a danger of banalization, that there becomes a kind of single art speak, as it were. But that doesn't worry me, because I think any art worth its name is going to transcend that. That I think artists absorb naturally a huge amount of information. I think they always have. And if they are good artists, they will transform that. They will transcend the sort of banalizing effect and take what they can, what they need, what they can use most. And we were saying earlier on that after all, this is a process that's been going on since the beginning of art. Perhaps not quite in the caves of Altamira and Lascaux, but perhaps even there, you know, you saw another cave and thought and was influenced by that. I mean, artists have always been influenced by other things, other people, other cultures. You know, just look what happened from Egypt through Greece to Rome to, you know, to 18th century Europe. All these things were feeding in. And of course, there was influence from the East through the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. There was quite a lot of absorption in various sort of artistic and decorative modes, whether it was chinoiserie or Japonisme or those kinds of influences. You know, America, a new country, influenced the world hugely in the mid-20th century. From the mid-20th century to certainly the end of the 20th century is still a sort of huge influence, but suddenly there was this explosion of abstract expressionism that had a worldwide effect, and it's always happening. The big difference now is that it's happening all the time from every point in the globe. So that is quite a bombardment, but I think art is, good art is very tough, it's very resilient. And so it will absorb and transform everything that's thrown at it. That is what art is. It's a kind of force for taking all kinds of strands of human experience and making something different and durable out of it. Mm. Everybody comes out of something particular, and they go into the general, possibly, but you've got to come out of something quite specific. You can't sort of just present yourself as a world artist. You have to have your own roots, your own traditions. And that's not disappeared, you know. I mean, we're not all the same. I doubt whether we'll ever be all the same. There's always, you know, I mean, you see, even in sort of politically, you know, where there's suddenly there's a grouping of states to become one country, and then suddenly one breaks off, or, you know, you get the Basque culture that remains, or the Welsh culture, or, you know, the Welsh language, which still exists. You know, there are plenty of natural defenses against a dull, banal globalization. So I'm not worried about that. I think that any good art will go further and will absorb whatever it wants, and to have that choice is a very, very exciting moment. I mean, it might be a bit overwhelming, but suddenly it's like, you know, a kid in a candy store. They've got all these things to sort of to choose from. Yeah. I'm sure that there was. I'm not sure that we actually...
Well, interestingly, Art International, under James Fitzsimmons, the original editor and
had
publisher,
a strong Oriental bent, didn't it?
Very strong.
Yes, because he happened to be born in China, you know, and so he was for classic Chinese art. Art International was actually was one of the few magazines, few sort of Western general magazines where Oriental art was discussed very regularly. Not necessarily contemporary.
No, I think when we were doing the magazine in the mid-1980s, not much was known about Asian contemporary art. I mean, you know, the occasional artist that would come to Europe and you'd meet, or you'd hear about their work, or there'd be an exhibition, but
that's one of the very big changes that has taken place, isn't it? Yes. I mean, there's a real shift in focus.
And perhaps it reflects a shift in the whole balance of power in the world, is one's feeling, isn't it? That as China is, you know, forecast to take over from the US as #1 economic power by the middle of the century, cultural relations shift too. And, you know, now we would, you know, often, I guess in the past, you know, people would have looked at this sort of magpieing from other cultures, can be looked at quite negatively as appropriating things that people don't necessarily understand, dipping into cultures, taking what you want. Well, it struck me that, you know, now China is in a position to do that to the West. They can pick and choose.
And I think they do, don't they? I mean, quite a few contemporary Chinese artists have started to appropriate and to make something different.
Yes, and it's very interesting what the Chinese artist, the twist it gets when it's going into a different culture. I mean, neither of us think of it as a negative thing, I don't think. We both think of it as something interesting and positive.
So I think you know, there is going to be probably things are just going to get much more fluid, but of course you can never tell. There are moments right the way through art history, there are moments of great fluidity. It is a bit like the economy, politics, etc. It's not such, you know, it's not a completely divorced phenomenon. Art is attached, as it were, at the hip to the economic and political situation of the world. So, you know, there will be other phases. There'll be other transformations. It may well be that art will will retrench. You know, this is a moment of, I think, a very exciting moment, and one we should celebrate and see the very positive sides. A moment of expansion and openness. And presumably because of that, of particularly intense creativity. So that can only be a good thing. There are always sort of artists who are better than others, and I think for that I was asked this morning, are there any guidelines? Well, that's a very difficult one, because you come back to the same thing each time, which is you can only trust, in the end, your own instinct about things. You can educate that instinct, you can look a lot, which you should, you could, listen to other people, talking about various aspects, but in the end, you are the sole judge of what you like and what you don't like, and that's really the whole purpose and the whole fun. Well, I think, I'm not sure I agree with you that they were made. I don't think in the end, you can sort of, if you like, you can sort of, create artificially a reputation. But I don't think it lasts. I mean, to take your example of the 80s, I think of many people, some of them quite good friends of mine, who have rather disappeared. They were, if you like, made to some extent by what you could call art world forces. But in the end, there's something about time that winnows false reputations out. I think real artists make themselves. I don't think that quality and talent is manipulated. It's either there or it isn't. You can have an artist of very medium talent, medium creativity, who, with a very keen sense, I won't name any names, but with a very keen sense of PR, of public relations, who can sort of project himself or herself in a very convincing fashion. And to an extent, that will work. But I think in the long term, and if one takes a historical view of this, you can see it, just think of the great sort of names of late 19th century art in France and in Germany and in Britain, the so-called Peppiatt painters, who are now sort of pretty much discredited. So you could say you could fool the people a little bit for a little while, but not for very long. You might be right that that reputations are made more by galleries now. I think that's probably true, yes. But you need to be a bit skeptical about this because, we're not idiots. I think we can see through the hype. And we can say, well, I'm not sure there's that much talent here. This has been well presented, but let's just look at the work. And that's all you've got, and that's what you need. I think you need to look at the work, you can listen to the hype, you can listen, you can read the books, etc., etc. The books hopefully are not hype, but there's some of that too. So in the end, you have to make up your own mind, and I think that's, part of what it's all about. So you don't listen to the hype, you listen to your own reaction.
I guess also with the sort of proliferation of world artists, there's also a huge proliferation of world collectors, aren't there? Well, collectors are coming from very diverse parts of the world, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. The main collectors would have been focused probably in the States and in Europe. Now there's an enormous number of exciting collections growing up everywhere in the world. And going straight to the auction houses, well, yes, one can look at that as a kind of rather unfortunate commercialization of things, and maybe for some of the young artists it's actually a bit problematic because their reputations are established so quickly, the prices go up so quickly, and then they've got to try and sustain that, which is difficult. But it has
happened before. It's not a completely contemporary phenomenon at all. This is where history helps. I think history is of huge value here. Because, we as human beings haven't changed that much. And okay, you know, Michelangelo was famous in his lifetime, so was Raphael. But there are a lot of artists who were sort of kind of hyped up by the Medicis or the great sort of families of Italy or Spain, you know, and who took on all these commissions, decorated private chapels, etc., and were paid sort of huge sums of money. But I think a lot of those have fallen by the wayside too. You know, this is not a new phenomenon. It might be a bit more intense and a bit more public. But,
yes, and maybe also perhaps a little bit more democratic.
Yeah.
That, you know, a collector now, you know, feels that he can go to an auction and buy something immediately, perhaps not knowing very much beforehand. There is, the negative and the positive are very tied up with each other, aren't they? There is a democratization, which I feel is a positive thing going on, but it has some negative implications maybe.
Well, I certainly would prefer, yes, my natural instinct, but then, you know, I'm of a certain generation, I would prefer everything to come from the artist and know without any assistance at all. But after all, these teams, we talk about the great names of the Renaissance, and they, of course, you know, Rubens, for instance, had a huge workshop, and there were people, for Van Dyck, for instance, there were people who specialized, it's a detail that's always amused me, in just doing hands or eyes. So, you know, they'd have the eye man in and then the hands man in, and then Van Dyck would come in and sort of do the, you know, the
finishing touches.
Ultima Mano, yes. I'm a little appalled, I have to say, when I hear that Jeff Koons has a team of, I don't know, I believe it's 90 people or something like that. It sounds like a factory. I guess, you know, I would prefer something, yes, my sympathies lie entirely with one person working in the studio, perhaps.
Well, I guess you can't imagine Francis Bacon letting anybody else touch one of his paintings.
No.
And that's Michael's taste.
That's my touchstone, in a way.
Yes.
A little of their work, what to expect, and so I just went up the Hudson River early one morning, and I got to their studio, and of course, you know, that is a real visual shock, because you've got a studio that must be 5 times as high as this tall room, and they had a couple of these amazing trees they built purely out of bamboo, strapped together. And we sort of talked about this and about that and about the trees and so on, walked round. And I can never, since they're identical twins, I don't know whether it was Mike or Doug, because they also had that rather unnerving thing that twins have of one begins a sentence and the other finishes it. So you're never quite sure who said what. But then they said, well, Michael, how about it? And I looked around nervously and I said, how about what? He said, going up. So I went up, and being quite heavy, the whole thing started to sway as I went up, and it went up and up and up.
Yes, I couldn't believe it, because I know Michael doesn't like heights.
And I don't like heights at all. But anyway, I did do it, and I have to say that, talk about exposure to new art, by the time I got to the top and gratefully began to sort of sway my way down with these things, and you know, you feel it could just throw you out. And they go up, I don't know how many meters tall they are, but they are quite tall. I thought that was a real sort of, baptism